That's within the context of working in that industry, right? Like you gotta, I mean, and there's we hear the idea of specialize as early as you can um, uh, on these things, but how does it impact? I guess sort of like the idea of non-work time. I mean, for millennials, like how does it manifest itself in the life spent outside of the market, or is that, or does that even make sense to say in the context of millennials?
It's definitely shrunk life outside the market. Social media, the tools we use to communicate themselves and express ourselves, to talk to our friends, are themselves for-profit platforms now. So if I spend my free time, my socializing time with my friends on the internet, talking to them through whatever ad-based platform or whatever, I'm giving that data over to whatever company. I'm still generating content for the market, for some market player, some very successful market players. In fact, some of the most successful companies are the ones who have found the space between work and life and done their best to dissolve it.
Um, it's interesting because I'm thinking of my daughter, who I guess is would be a Generation Z. She's 12. But she communicates to her friends via Instagram, and of course, um, she is both she's the product in that moment. She's also creating product for the platform, and then also is being trained to be her self worth is is a function of how many likes or connections she accumulates on that platform. So it's a constant. It's basically like asking a fish, like, what's it feel to be wet? I guess.
Absolutely, and that's for a reason. That's useful. So when I was applying for jobs, in college and after college, one of the first things they would ask me was about my social media proficiency, and I didn't have to have done it professionally. That was just, can you do this? Can you do this for us? So those kind of skills are one of the things that millennials end up being valued for. So yeah, that's still market connected. Absolutely. She's still working.
So what? So and what is the level of consciousness amongst? Do you think of your cohorts, the people in your cohort? What is the consciousness of this of this dynamic, or is it the fish is like, I don't know, it's wet? I mean, what do you mean? We're in water. I mean, is that how much awareness of this do you think your fellow millennials have?
I think it's changing. I think people are gaining perspective and more useful frames to understand what's going on, which is very hard because we've existed under this sort of neoliberal end of history framework for our whole lives in terms of our engagement with politics. And now we need something different because we're trying to understand what's going on and it doesn't fit in with that idea. At the same time, millennials don't own a lot of TV stations, radio stations, whatever, don't hold a lot of columnist jobs. A lot of the content about millennials is made by other people who might not have the same interests or might have other, psychological needs to make up caricatures about this cohort. So we still have that kind of propaganda poisoning our minds.
It's interesting because that dynamic which you just described, I mean, that it's always been the case, right? I mean, that there are generations that are older than you that attempt to define who you are. I mean, one thing that I really am curious your thoughts on is that for people in my generation who were younger than baby boomers, I think to a large extent there was very little room for our generation in all facets of society, simply because there were so many people in the baby boom, and that for a long time, their tastes, whether they were commercial tastes or artistic tastes or whatever, their life experiences dominated in the same way that a sapling is just not going to grow behind a big tree because it's just not going to get the enough. It can't compete for the water. It's not going to get enough sunlight, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if there is that the distance between that baby boom cohort, right, which is aging out now, and I do want to talk about maybe the implications of that, but that cohort, and they're not really they're being this sort of like missing, Generation X on some level, that if you don't see the opportunity for millennials to begin to really have a lot of sway over where we go next.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at the particular relations between particular cohorts and not get into archetypical thinking with regard to generations. Because when you start to dig into that kind of thinking, it usually turns out it's not that old. And in fact, that it was a story made up by the baby boomers. So our idea of how generations relate to each other, period, is a story made up by the baby boomers. And you're right that they have controlled a surprising, disproportionate amount of history of how things have gone. And that has continued into our time. And I'm not sure how much they are phasing out that cohort. If you look at Congress, for example, refuses to phase out. Certainly in terms of wealth, they have not phased out. And that is a particular cohort. It's not just, old people in general, or your old people versus our old people or whatever. The baby boomers in America was a particular cohort that experienced and has experienced more prosperity than perhaps any national cohort of all time. And obviously it hasn't been evenly distributed, far from it. But they're not, have not been invested that much in the reproduction of their success.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos